Hello everyone, and welcome to Bio 585 Neuroscience. Our first lecture is an introduction to the nervous system. Neuroscience is the study of the development, chemistry, structure, function, and pathology of the nervous system. The purpose of our nervous system is the transmission of information. Information from within and information from without. In order for us to have voluntarily guided movements, in order to have to respond to the environment and the needs of the context of the situation, we need to have information about what's going on within us and what's going on outside of us. And that's what the nervous system does. The nervous system can be broken up in different ways. One way is by geography. There are two geographical subdivisions of the nervous system. There's the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Thinking about what you've read and what you learned in anatomy, what parts can you think of that make up the central nervous system? And what parts make up the peripheral nervous system? So again, we have the central nervous system, or the CNS, and the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS. The CNS consists of the brain, brainstem, and the cerebellum that is associated with the brainstem, and the spinal cord, whereas the peripheral nervous system consists of the spinal nerves and the cranial nerves. The nervous system can also be broken up into functional subdivisions. It can be functionally divided into the motor and sensory systems. Thinking back to your anatomy, what kinds of motor are there? And what types of structures do the different types of motor neurons innervate? Similarly for sensory, what kinds of sensory neurons are there? And what type of structures do these different sensory neurons innervate? Dividing functionally our nervous system into motor and sensory, we can further subdivide these into their component parts. The motor nervous system can be broken up into the voluntary motor system and the autonomic motor system. You learned about these in anatomy, dealing with the muscles of the trunk and limbs predominantly for the voluntary motor, and the viscera for the autonomic motor. Voluntary motor innervates skeletal muscle, whereas autonomic motor innervates smooth muscle and cardiac muscle. The sensory system can be broken up into three different subgroups. These would be somatosensory, viscerosensory, and special sensory, although some people will put viscerosensory as a part of somatosensory. Somatosensory is going to innervate things like our skin, our muscles, and our joints. When you see the term somato or somatic, it means muscle, bone, and skin, and cutaneous and subcutaneous tissues. So the innervation for sensation of those tissues is our somatosensory system. Visceral sensory uses very similar neurons and receptors, sensory receptors, so it essentially uses the same basic foundation, but instead of giving us information from the skin and the muscles and our joints and tendons, it's giving information related to blood vessels and our thoracic and abdominal organs, so your stomach, your bladder, your heart, etc. And then we have special sensory, all of which is located in the head. And special sensory gives us the senses of vision and hearing, taste and smell, and equilibrium. Throughout this semester, you will find terminology to be one of your biggest challenges. There is a large number of new terms. I cannot stress or emphasize enough the number of new terms you will be learning this semester, related to not only structures, but also pathologies or signs and symptoms, if you prefer. Terms such as apraxia and ataxia. Terms related to structures such as the caudate nucleus or the thalamus. So there will be a large number of new terms that you are going to need to know and understand. So one suggestion that I have for you is to make up a glossary as you go along. Every time you come across a new term, either in your textbook readings or listening to your lectures, or maybe doing some outside investigating, if you are trying to get a little better handle on an idea, and maybe you do a little search online, or you're looking at another textbook and you see a term that you're not familiar with, that you add it to your glossary. By taking and physically making this glossary yourself, whether you handwrite it or I would suggest typing it so that you can easily alphabetize, that is going to help you to remember what the terms mean, as opposed to simply highlighting a term that's written in your textbook or highlighting one of your lecture notes. Taking that short time to take that term and define it in your own words, you'll actually remember much better. So I'm going to start you off with a few terms that we're going to be using extensively throughout the course. The first group of terms are related to groups of axons, typically myelinated, although not always, but bundles of axons that are within the central nervous system. And what you have are groups of axons that carry similar information, will always travel together. Kind of think of them as like cliques. You know, they all are carrying the same kind of information, just from a little bit different part of the body, so they all travel together. These bundles of axons travel in what are called tracks. Sometimes it's called a lemniscus, which means a ribbon. I think that's the name given to some of these tracks that are a little more kind of broad and flat and a little wavy as opposed to more rounded. They can also be called a fasciculus. So you'll find that a lot of times we're going to have either a name that's got a tract in the name, lemniscus in the name, or fasciculus. Then we have columns and peduncles or capsules. Columns, peduncles, and capsules tend to carry more than one tract or lemniscus or fasciculus. For example, there's an area in the spinal cord that is called the dorsal column. Within the dorsal column are two fasciculi, the fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus. You'll learn those terms in the next unit when you'll be identifying them and drawing them on a cross-section of a spinal cord. But the idea is just that these are all just groups of axons traveling from one part of the central nervous system to another. And kind of single groups of axons carrying similar information are called either a tract, a lemniscus, or a fasciculus. And columns or peduncles or capsules carry more than one of those tracts within it. Peduncles specifically are going to be connecting the brainstem to other parts of the central nervous system. So we're going to have peduncles connecting the brainstem to the cerebrum, or what we think of as the brain, and peduncles that are connecting the brainstem to the cerebellum. Those peduncles will be named for the structure that they're connecting the brainstem to. So we have the cerebral peduncles connecting the brainstem to the cerebrum, and the cerebellar peduncles connecting the brainstem to the cerebellum. A ganglion is a collection of neuron cell bodies located outside of the central nervous system. You learned several of these in anatomy. You learned about the dorsal root ganglion. We also learned about the preaortic ganglia for the autonomic nervous system, and the paravertebral ganglia making up the sympathetic trunk on either side of the vertebral column. we're going to learn a few more ganglia this semester in neuroscience, as well as revisit those ganglia that you already know. A nucleus, on the other hand, is a collection of neuron cell bodies within the central nervous system. So they're really the same thing. They're just groups or collections of neuron cell bodies, and it's important that they're neuron cell bodies because there are other kinds of cells within the nervous system. But these neuron cell bodies, if they are outside the central nervous system, somewhere in the peripheral nervous system, they are called a ganglion. When they're within the central nervous system, they're called a nucleus. Other terms, some of which you're familiar with and some of which are new to you. Ipsilateral on the same side of the body and contralateral on the opposite side of the body. Those terms you should already know from anatomy. But these next two may be new. Rostral and caudal. Rostral and caudal are frequently used when discussing the spinal cord and the brainstem. Rostral means to be located more superiorly, whereas caudal means to be located more inferiorly. We don't use the term cranial and caudal because the brainstem is already within the cranium. So rostral and caudal are the terms that you will see used when referencing the brainstem and spinal cord. And then we have dorsal and ventral. Dorsal meaning posterior and ventral anterior. When you're talking about at least the spinal cord and the brainstem. Interestingly, when you get to the brain, that changes. Dorsal now means the superior part of the brain, and ventral means the inferior part of the brain. It's no longer anterior and posterior. And that is because that when you are developing, your brain essentially bends over, if you will. There's between the brainstem and the brain, there's a flexion that takes place. So that the original anterior part of the brain is now facing inferiorly. And the original posterior part of the brain is now facing superiorly. So when talking about the brain, dorsal is superior, ventral is inferior. But when talking about the brainstem and the spinal cord, dorsal and ventral have the same meaning as they did when you were discussing the trunk or the limbs last semester. Other terms you should be familiar with describe different regions of the nervous system. The peripheral region of the nervous system is the part of the nervous system that lies outside of the bony confines of the skull and vertebral column. This is not the same as the peripheral subdivision of the nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system and the peripheral region are slightly different. And what makes them different is that there is a small part of the peripheral nervous system, the dorsal and ventral roots, for instance, with the dorsal root ganglion, that are in the peripheral nervous system. They're outside of the spinal cord, but yet they're contained within the vertebral column. So they are within the spinal region of the nervous system. So the spinal region of our nervous system consists of all parts of the nervous system that are contained within the vertebral column. So this will be the spinal cord, the dorsal and ventral roots, the dorsal root ganglion, our cauda equina. That's all within the vertebral column. However, anything that is outside the spinal cord is part of our peripheral nervous system. So that can be confusing using there's a peripheral term for a region and peripheral for division. But basically, they're the same thing with the exception of just that small part of where we have our dorsal and ventral roots and dorsal root ganglion. Similarly, in the skull, we have a small part of our cranial nerve, which is outside of the brainstem before it actually gets out of the skull. Just, small segments, but they do have to get through the skull in order to exit. So the little part that is within the skull would be still part of the peripheral nervous system, but it would not be on the peripheral region of the nervous system until it got outside of that skull. The brainstem is the part of the central nervous system that connects the cerebrum and the spinal cord. It contains a lot of tracts carrying information from the spinal cord to the brain and from the brain down to the spinal cord. And it is made up from inferior to superior, or from caudal to rostral, of the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. Now the midbrain is also called the mesencephalon. Each of these areas have other names associated with them. I'm not going to ask you to know those names. You're not going into research where you would need to know the difference between the metencephalon, for instance, or the myelencephalon, and the mesencephalon. But I do want you to know the term for the midbrain, the mesencephalon, because there are structures that are named mesencephalic. And if you understand that that means midbrain, you'll know exactly where those structures are located. So mesencephalon is a term you would want to have in your glossary. Our final two regions of the nervous system are the cerebellum and the cerebrum. The cerebellum, also known as the little brain, sits dorsal to the brainstem. It is connected to the brainstem by white matter tracts or groups of axons that are traveling to and from the cerebellum, and these would be the cerebellar peduncles. The cerebellum itself has two large hemispheres and a midline structure called the vermis. And we'll talk a lot more about the cerebellum and the cerebellar peduncles and what specific tracts run in those peduncles when we talk about the cerebellum and the brainstem in Unit 3. The cerebrum is made up of two cerebral hemispheres. And these cerebral hemispheres are covered with the cerebral cortex. Now, the cerebral cortex is like taking a nucleus and stretching it out in order to cover the surface of the hemispheres. As you recall, a nucleus is a group of neuron cell bodies within the central nervous system. So the cerebral cortex is really just a group of neuron cell bodies, and their large dendrites. We'll talk about dendrites more in the next lecture. But it's the cell bodies that cover the surface of the cerebral hemispheres. Deep to the cortex, so subcortical, we have the diencephalon. The diencephalon consists of a group of nuclei, including the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the epithalamus, and the subthalamus. The thalamus and the hypothalamus are actually groups of individual nuclei that are all kind of held together into that structure, so that they will have nuclei within them. And we will learn several of the nuclei within the thalamus. We will not learn the individual nuclei within the hypothalamus in this course. And finally, we have an image that I'd like you to get to know very well and to be able to label this image correctly and completely. This is representing the central nervous system with a cross-section of the spinal cord shown at the bottom. Let's go ahead and label the different major parts of this diagram. First, we have the cerebrum, our brain. Next, we have the brain stem. Notice its top and bottom borders. And finally, we have the spinal cord. So if we're not looking at the cross-section of the spinal cord at the bottom, but just looking at the image that is above that, the very bottom of that image where the vertical line has ended, that would be spinal cord. From the beginning of the vertical line all the way up till we get to the where things start to go out to the hemispheres, that would be the brainstem. And then everything else would be cerebrum, with the exception of another structure that is on either side of the brainstem, and that we'll label shortly as well. Now, adding in some additional labels, we have those two circles up in the cerebrum. Those subcortical structures would be the right and left thalamus. Now I do want to mention, whenever you're looking at a drawing like this, you need to imagine you are looking at a person from the front. So they're facing you, which means that your right is their left and vice versa. So where the word cerebrum is on this slide, that is the right side, and the thalamus is written on the left side. Now, there are two cerebral hemispheres, a right and a left. There are two thalami, a right and a left. I've only labeled one thalamus and the cerebrum as a whole, but you want to make sure that you are aware the right side of the nervous system in this drawing would be on your left side of the paper. All right, now moving on, we have the cerebral hemisphere is really, in this image, is made up of two different lobes. You'll notice about midway down on the side of the cerebral hemisphere on either side, there is a gap, an indentation that looks kind of like a sideways T. Above that gap is one lobe. Beneath that gap is the other lobe. Above that gap is either the frontal or the parietal lobe. Depending on what we're going to be drawing, you will be instructed as to which lobe it is. The lobe that is beneath that gap is called the temporal lobe. Moving into the brainstem, we have the midbrain or mesencephalon, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, which is frequently abbreviated just as the medulla, but its technical name is medulla oblongata. On either side of the pons, you can see another structure. These represent the cerebellar hemispheres. Now, in reality, they would not be off to the side like that. The cerebellum sits posterior or dorsal to the brainstem. But in order for us to give a representation of that cerebellum on this picture, they had to be drawn off to either side. Then looking at the spinal cord, we have the dorsal horn, the ventral horn, the central canal, and something new called Lissauer's tract. By new, I mean new to many of you, because we did not talk about this in anatomy. Lissauer's tract is the vestibule of the spinal cord. This is where all sensory information first enters. Before going to the part of the spinal cord it needs to go to in order to travel to its final destination. So everything comes in as far as sensation. Everything enters the spinal cord through Lissauer's tract. That's the end of our first lecture. Again, I want to make sure that you can label all of these parts without looking them up. I also want you to be starting your glossary and writing your own definitions of items so that they become ingrained in, you don't even have to think about them. You'll know what they mean when you hear them or read them. Our next lecture will be on the different types of cells within the nervous system.